Hello and welcome back! Whenever I tell someone that one of my favorite genres is historical fiction, I get some mixed responses. Ew, history? Gross. I don't want to be rude, but history is boring. Ugh, you like historical fiction? Why are you so ugly? So, today I would like to show you that historical fiction can actually be a very wide and varied genre. I'm going to show you some of my favorite historical fiction books, and I'm willing to bet you've even read a couple and not even realized you were reading historical fiction. Lame, boring historical fiction. Also keep in mind that some of these historical fiction books are just historical fictions, while some are historical fantasy fiction. I'll make the distinction when they come up, but it's important to know that historical fiction can be both. Let's get started. First up is Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafon. This is a love letter to readers around the world. Taking place in 1945 Barcelona, this is a story of a young boy who finds an author he really loves, and then as he tries to find another book by that author, he finds that a lot of this author's books are being destroyed systematically. It's a super interesting mystery with some of the most beautiful writing you will ever read. Something I like about this book is that it takes ideas that we all love, like finding authors you love to read, seeking out books, seeking out knowledge, and it shows that even in 1945 Barcelona, this was still something people cared about. Also, this is absolutely a gorgeous book. If you haven't read it, you just go. You know what? I lied. Don't leave yet. Just hang around, but then, you know. Next up is The Library of Legends. Now, this book is mostly just historical fiction, but it does have some elements of fantasy weaved in. So, one of my favorite things about historical fiction is when I get to read about events in history that I had no idea even happened. So this takes place in 1937 when Japanese bombs were being dropped in China. We see a group of college students essentially taking this historical ancient library of tomes and trying to transport them to safety so they're not blown up in the bombings. There's also a lot of really interesting cultural aspects to this book, talking about what was going on in 1937 in China. Things like discussing the rise of the Communist Party and why that was so appealing at the time. It also does weave in some really interesting mythology, as well as, like I said, a little bit of fantasy. So if you're sick of reading historical fiction that has to do with Europe, where a lot of it does take place, try something out in a different country. You might enjoy it. Now we're gonna go full-on fantasy for a minute as we talk about The Kingdom of Back by Mary Lou. This is the story of Nannerl Mozart, who is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's sister. So deep down, this is a story about how Nannerl was writing music as well as her brother, but she never really got any of the credit and wasn't really remembered by history. But it does also weave in all these really interesting like fairy tale aspects to show her kind of being ambitious, going after what she wanted, and the price of all of that. It's a really fun story if you like classical music or if you just are looking for a different take on Mozart. It's also fun to just see a young adult fantasy take on historical fiction. Now, there are many books in the historical fiction genre that basically take a story we know and flip it on its head. When I think about books like this, I think of Song of Achilles or Circe, books that take an idea and a story we think we know and kind of flip it on its head. Well, recently I had the joy of reading The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd. Essentially, this is a story of a young woman named Anna, who is basically a way ahead of her time feminist, who ends up being the wife of someone you may have heard of named Jesus. For those who are deeply devout, I will mention it is historical fiction, and the author does make sure to mention that. She's not trying to rewrite history, she's just trying to tell a story using history. Which is what historical fiction is, would you look at that? It's really fun to take a look at the story of Jesus through these eyes. And this book portrays Jesus as very human and basically just a prophet that really moved people to action. And the crazy thing about this book is that this is the most human portrayal of Jesus I think I've ever read or seen, yet I found myself more moved by his actions in his life from this historical fiction story than I ever did from hearing about them in church. I'm not saying you're gonna have the same response to this book. What I am saying is that sometimes historical fiction can be great because it can help us to see a time in history or even people from history in a completely different light than we did before, and maybe even respect them more than we did originally. There's no way that I'm gonna talk about historical fiction without talking about one of my absolute favorite authors who lives the historical fiction life in his writing, which is Ken Follett, and especially his book, The Pillars of the Earth. Ken Follett is a historical fiction mastermind. His writing is so interesting, and his characters are so relatable, even though they're from way, way long ago. His characters are great. He basically takes heroic type characters and places them in just the worst situations, and by the end, you are just cheering and cheering and cheering for them to finally get something good to happen to them. Ken Follett is another great example of a writer who makes me care about historical events that I didn't even know happened. And something else I love about Ken Follett is when I'm reading his books, I find myself constantly Googling events that happens in the books because I'm like, wow, did that really happen? How did that really happen? What was this character like? Things like that. And that's exciting about historical fiction. When a historical fiction book gets you excited about history, that is a win in my book. Taking place in the late 1800s, this is a story of basically a magical circus where two magicians are pitted against each other in a competition of magic. This next one is one that I feel like a lot of people don't know about, even though it is night circus level quality good. It is The Golem and the Jinni by Helen Wecker. Taking place at the turn of the century, starting in about 1899, this is the story of a female golem, which is coming from Jewish mythology, and a Jinni, which is coming from more Muslim mythology. And the two of them meet in turn of the century New York City. So the history element of this book is really looking at turn of the century New York City and really looking at the different religions and the different races of people that were living in New York City at the time and the way that they were divided into different neighborhoods. It's also really looking at those specific people, especially the Jewish people and the Muslim people, and looking at how they were treated at the time, as well as kind of what their communities looked like at the time in New York City. This book is beyond good. I feel like it's a hidden gem because anytime I pull it out to talk about it, people have never heard of it before. It's even sometimes hard to find in bookstores. Ultimately, this is a story about two people from very different backgrounds who find each other and have more in common than not. Not saying this happens, but sometimes people from different backgrounds think that they have a lot of differences, so they fight with each other, and then it turns out they actually have a lot of similarities. Who knew? The last book on my list is one I actually just finished last week, but it's so good that it finds a spot in this video. And that is the new Skywatchers from Carrie Arcos. So this book is very Stranger Things-esque, except it takes place in 1952. Very Cold War era. At the time, there was a lot of worry that the Russians were going to drop a bomb on the US. So they recruited different groups, as well as these kids in high school were in a club where they basically had to go out every day and watch to see if planes or unexplained phenomenon were coming out of the sky, and then report it to like a central hub. Well, the kids do end up seeing something coming out of the sky, and they go to follow it into the woods, and then the next thing they know, they're running through the woods trying to get home. They're all separated, and days have gone by, and they've been missing this whole time. So, of course, there's this element of like, was it UFOs? Was it aliens? What was this unexplained object? And these teenagers kind of have to work together to figure out like what happened and unravel the mystery. Okay, so obviously the focus here is sci-fi, but there is some really cool history. In particular, one of the characters, John, is Japanese. And we see that his family was actually put into one of the internment camps when Japanese were rounded up into camps after Pearl Harbor. And seeing how his family has kind of like come back from that to like go back to living in their same neighborhood, you know, still being around their old neighbors is super interesting. It's honestly a perspective I don't think I've ever really seen in a young adult sci-fi book before. And aside from that, just the history of this whole Cold War era and just how that was affecting the world and, you know, what the teenagers thought about of it at the time and, you know, how people were reporting these things that they saw in the sky. I just found all of it super interesting. And to top all of that amazing history off, the sci-fi mystery of this book is bananas good. For those of you new to my channel, bananas good is like one of the highest echelons of goodness. Look, if nothing else, I hope you saw a book in this video that you want to check out. Historical fiction is so much more than just reading about history. It's about reading about characters in history and really seeing how that relates to what we're going through today. It's almost comforting to know that people 200 or 300 years ago had similar issues to the issues we're dealing with today. I also love walking away from a book and knowing that I learned something. That to me is so exciting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you enjoyed any of these books or if there's a historical fiction book that I left out that you think that should be talked about more. Leave that in the comments. Make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, do all the things, and I will see you next time. Have a wonderful week and happy reading.